Hello and welcome to my latest video on how to paint the Stormcast Eternal Special Character. This time I'm going to be looking at how to paint the skin, eyes and hair. Obviously this is a very small area on the model and it's a small model to begin with, so it's going to be quite hard to show the details very clearly, but I'm going to do my best and then I'll talk you through it as well. So starting with the skin, there's just going to be three colours that we're going to use. The main colour would be Cadian Fleshtone. I'm starting using that now on the model. The highlight colour is Ryn Flesh. It's a P3 paint, and then for shading I'm going to be using Mournfang brown. So to start with, as I said, we're using Cadian Fleshtone, and all I'm doing is picking out the main highlight points. Now this is more of a guide than anything, because obviously with the really dark paint on there to begin with, the whole face is going to have to be eventually painted in. I can't leave the shadows that dark on it because it'll just look incredibly heavily shadowed and it will look quite weird. But this will just guide me as I go along, so the face structure is much easier to work with. The paint's thinned, I think roughly about 50-50 water to paint. It's somewhere along the lines of double cream, maybe, yeah, something like that. Because so for that colour you wanted a little bit thicker, because you're going over a dark colour to begin with. So that slightly thicker colour will obviously then make a positive mark, whereas if you had this colour too thin, it'll take you a long time to build up the paint. You can see here, so the highlight points I've picked out are the cheek, jawline, nose and forehead. Now one tricky part of this is obviously I'm painting it from one angle here, but I'm also going to be rotating the model to paint it from the front view. What this means is that the highlight points will change as you rotate it, so it's going to have to be kind of focused from the main view, which is the side here, but still transition into the front view so that it doesn't look weird. You'll see that as we go along. But because it's such a small area, you have an easier time. If it was a much larger area, it would be more difficult to paint it from one side and then another, but the size of the model does give you a little bit of leeway. So now you can see she looks a little bit undead, which I think if you want to go for that look, that's fine, but it's blocked in the important light points. Now here you can see from the front that obviously the face is really dark still because I haven't painted it. So what I'm going to have to do is use the forehead again as a light point, and I'm tilting the model slightly, keeping the first painted side out of view. So this gives me a little bit more space to work with for this new lighting direction. But as I said, I can't have light coming from the main side and then this alternate side, because then that will leave a dark line directly down the middle of the face. So it all has to be kind of blended together subtly. What you will find though is on large models and things like busts, what people tend to do is purposefully do this kind of thing, where they'll have a main light coming from one direction and then a secondary light from another, and it can create some really cool dramatic effects. But it's really hard to do that on a 28mm model, because there's just not the space there to work with. So all I'm doing is building up the layers using that Cadian Fleshtone. It will be the main colour throughout the painting, because although I said that the main primer colour is all going to be painted over, there is still a certain amount of transparency to that Cadian Fleshtone paint. Now I'm working using the Ryn Flesh. It's a very pale pink. It looks kind of white in the video. For some reason the contrast is a bit too high, but at least it's making the armour look very shiny. So for the Ryn Flesh, I'm just picking out the highlight points again, but obviously not going over the whole area. So it's just like the highest highlight points, so the forehead, cheek, nose again. And it's a very similar system to how the armour was painted. So again, you can hold the model under a lamp or something like that and look for reference to how light hits it. And the added benefit of doing it this way is that it will then be it will work with the rest of the model that's been painted this way for the lighting. It's all coherent. So that's something that I will actually be carrying across also to the fur on the shoulder and cloak. So all of the parts on the model, the lighting must be consistent. So there you see again, I'm just using that Ryn Flesh to highlight the top of the forehead where the light is mainly catching it. And that's also where the hairline is. So you'll have to be a bit careful on that, because you don't want an incredibly hard hairline. The hair is going to be black anyway. And with the pale skin, you get this really hard line between the hair and the face, and then it'll look like a wig. Because if you look at a normal hairline, it's not a very hard line. You've got like a variation and softening in between where the hair, there's certain strands of hair that go over the line and things like that. And there's also a small amount of shadow, especially as the curve of the head goes up towards the hairline. So what I've done is not actually take the highlight right up onto the hair. There's a thin layer of just plain Cadian Fleshtone in between the Ryn Flesh and the hairline. So now I'm using the Mournfang brown. It might seem a strange colour to use on the face. One thing it is doing is again creating that consistent lighting, because there's so much Mournfang brown used on the armour. It means that the lighting then looks similar throughout. I think I've mentioned this in previous videos, but it is a good idea to use some of the same paints throughout the whole model, regardless of what it is you're painting, because then it keeps the lighting consistent throughout the model, like the colour of the light. Because obviously, if you go out into daylight, then the light hitting you is all the same colour, and it will affect the colour of everything you're wearing. If you go into a room with, say, red lights, it will affect the colour of everything you're wearing again. And so the same is true for the model. So if you try and keep some of the same colours used on every part of the model, it'll have that same effect of making it look consistent. So what I'm doing here is going back to using the Cadian Fleshtone and blending in that Mournfang brown. And not just blending it in, but kind of toning it down a bit as well, because it is a very harsh brown in comparison to the flesh colours. It is really important to work on the shapes of the face, and the shapes are created using how the light hits them. If you just paint the whole thing Cadian Fleshtone and then you highlight it up in layers, it's going to look very artificial. It really helps to block in these highlight points and then work around them, shade underneath them, and then you can carefully blend those colours in, because the light from the lamp, as I said, for creating those highlight points is really helping me create the shape of the face. Now you have to rely on what the sculptor's done a little bit for the expression, obviously, but you can tweak it a bit. So I'm making my expression extra mean looking, and that's enhanced by the heavy shadowing around the eye socket. And what you'll actually notice is that I don't paint that much in the eye socket. Well, I'll leave that for when we get to that stage. But here you can see I'm emphasising the cheek a little bit more. I put the highlight too far back there, close to the ear. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's emphasising a part of the face that I don't want. I want the forward face area to be more of the focus. So you have to tweak the lighting a little bit to make it work. You don't just automatically copy whatever the lamp hitting the model says. You sometimes have to tweak it to make it look and show exactly what you want, but use that light as a guide. So as I said, that cheek highlight was a bit far back, but eventually I'll tone that down a bit because I want the face itself and the front expression to be the main part of the head. So you might notice as well that I'm not using much in the way of glazing or anything like that. I must say actually though that the Mournfang brown, that is heavily watered down on the wet palette. You can't see it too much, but that's probably 3:1 water to paint. So it's kind of a heavy glaze colour, that is. You have to be a little bit careful on the features here, so obviously the nose and the lips. I haven't painted the lips a different colour. I do actually at one point use some Galvaback red because that was on the palette from some previous painting. I think it was actually from doing the cloak, and I just put a slight glaze of that over the lips, but I really don't want the lip look. I don't want it to look like she's wearing lipstick. She's not painted up to go out to war. I want it to be quite a serious face. And I don't really see Stormcast Eternals putting on lipstick before they go out to fight. So here you can see that I was using the Cadian Fleshtone again, just to tone down that rear part of the cheekbone. And again, just going over some of those highlight points, particularly that cheekbone there at the front and top of the forehead, and also the lower eyelid, because one, that's again reinforcing the light direction and also helps to enhance the facial expression. Top of the lip as well. What you should find with the top of the lip is that's actually flesh and not lip coloured from where the light is catching it. You wouldn't really see much in the way of the lips themselves from that angle. It's mainly just the bottom lip that you would see. So the technique I'm using to blend these face colours together is lots of very, very small, fine brush strokes. What you'll actually find is a lot of well-known painters use the same technique for blending. You don't always have to use glazes and lots of thin layers. You can use slightly thicker paint than you would imagine, and you just apply it very, very gently with lots of quick marks, and it'll still have that soft blended look. So what I'm doing here is getting rid of this hard shadow line between the ear and the cheekbone, because it looks very artificial. You don't want these basically black lines on the face. As I said, the process is to put the highlight points on. You keep expanding, filling in areas as you go, because it gives you like a structure to work with, rather than just painting the whole thing in Fleshtone and then painting on highlights and painting on shadows. As you can see as well, the process has been fairly quick to this point. You could do this sort of painting for your army. This is ideal actually for tabletop sort of painting, because you don't need to paint it incredibly carefully. You don't need all the special blending and things like that, and the shading is because it's quite high contrast, will stand out on the tabletop, so the expression will be much more visible. Right, so what happened there was, what I found when trying to paint the other side of the face was that I couldn't show it on the camera. It was just you just couldn't see it. Like for the angle that I was painting at, it was basically making it invisible. So what I'm instead doing is going on to painting the eyes. Now, the eyes on this model are very, very small, so you need a very good point on your brush. You can see the colours that I've used there, Ceramite white and Lothern blue, they're mixed together in a blend. It's actually very pale, but there's just that tiny blue hint adds a bit more realism to the eyes. Now it's a slightly funny angle and things like that, and you can see that the model holder that I'm using is also resting down on the table. You need to be very steady when doing this. And all I'm doing is just literally painting the eye that's sculpted on the model. And you need to be careful to leave what is still the primer in there, because as I said, I'm using the shading on the in the eye socket to add that really mean expression. So there's it, close up. You can see I've just painted the white of the eye there. I'm going to try and paint it on the other side. So just looking at the face there, how I've painted it, you can see it's just a continuation of the other side, with the light hitting it from a slightly different angle. But then I blended it in the centre, as I was talking about, on the forehead, with just a little bit of shadow to emphasise that the side that you can see now is the main focal point. Right, so I'm actually going to use black paint, and it's Abaddon black. Some people say don't use black paint when painting pupils and eyes, but I find that 28mm, that painting them other colours, they don't stand out that well, especially because in this case it's already in shadow. I'm having the model looking forward, so most of the pupil is at the very front of the eye. Obviously the pupil is front, but I mean, so she's facing, looking the way that she's going. Now here, the brush is getting caught on the cloak on her shoulder. But it's important to look at the first eye that you painted while you're painting in the second eye, because you don't want her to look goggle-eyed. For anyone interested, the brushes I'm using are Artis Opus Series S brushes. I'm testing them out. They're not available yet, but so far I'm really enjoying them. There were Artis Opus brushes I've been using previously as well, but they looked black and they weren't, didn't have any advertising or anything on them, because they were pre-production ones that they wanted me to test out. But so the size that I'm using at the moment is a size 1. You don't, but I find the tips sharp enough that you don't need to go any smaller than that anyway. So there, what I was doing was deciding if I was going to put white reflections in the eye, reflections in the eyes. What you're going to see is me attempting to put the white reflections in, and then messing about with it and deciding it's not worth it. Because what happens is that the eyes are so small. When you put these reflections on, you need them both to be exactly in the right spot. Now some people, when they put them on, they just put a dot in. Generally you need bigger eyes than this. Once you put the white dot in, it takes up obviously space away from the pupil, and if the pupil's so small, when you put the white dot on it, it just makes the pupil look even smaller. So it's kind of a balance. If you have a slightly larger eye, putting that white dot in is much easier, and you put it in at an angle, because obviously you don't want the white dot in the middle of the eye, because that makes it look like the eyes are glowing. What I actually found on this model as well was that one of her eyes is slightly bigger than the other. When I she's almost pulling can you smell what the rock is cooking face with one of her eye, the eye on the left bulging out a bit. But I just tweaked the painting a little bit to make it match better. So as I said, for this kind of thing, especially for putting these white reflection dots in the eyes, you need to be very stabilized, because they need to be precise for where you put them. You can't just put two white reflections, one on each eye, because if they don't match, and when I say match, they both either have to be on one side or the other. So people get confused on this. So when Games Workshop paints Space Marines, you'll see that for the lenses that they paint, they have a highlight at one side and then the white reflection dot in the dark corner at the other. And this works really well because of the high contrast of the dark in the corner with the white dot on, then with the transition up to the nice highlight. And then they do that same thing on the other eye. Now, Space Marine helmets are designed so you don't really see both eyes at the same time, but it's actually wrong, because the highlights are always going towards the centre and the white dots are always in the corner, but that doesn't make any sense in terms of realistic lighting. If you have white dots, the light is coming from the same direction to hit both eyes, so the white dots would either be on both to the right of the eye or to the left of the eye, or wherever you're going to put them. So what happens is people see that that's how Games Workshop painting these Space Marine eyes, and they do the same thing when painting normal eyes, and it makes the eyes look wrong because the lighting isn't consistent. So if you're going to put white dots on eyes, make sure that they're consistently placed in the position either to one side or the other. I hope that makes sense. There are lots of techniques for painting eyes. If you want something that's a little bit easier, because obviously I've done that, and I basically just painted in white eyes and then pupils on top, and obviously it can be quite tricky. If you want an easier technique, do the eyes before you paint the skin. So what happens then is you paint the white eyeball, paint a black line down the middle of the eye or wherever abouts you want the pupil to be, and you can go over a bit the skin that way, because obviously you're going to paint the skin on top afterwards, and so you've already got the eyes sorted, and you can be a bit more sloppy with how you paint the eyeball along, so obviously you're allowing yourself that line going over, and then when you paint the flesh around it, the eye will still look natural again. So this is where I'm just painting on that Galvaback red that I've mentioned, just to add a slight bit of colour to the lips. But it's only a glaze, it's not, I don't want the lips to be bright red. Not that Galvaback is a bright red anyway, but I just want sort of like make them a bit more pinkish, because I'd already painted the lower lip with Cadian Fleshtone, so that's skin colour with a glaze of Galvaback red, creates that sort of pinkish look. So there you can see the white highlight that I put in the eye. Well, it's quite hard to see, but if you take my word for it, it still made the eyes look a bit weird. It made the eye look too open. So that white highlight is basically just making the white of the eye look bigger. And that's why I say really you need bigger eyes, or that kind of thing anyway. You just need a bit more space to work with, and especially because of how I painted the white of the eye to begin with. If you wanted, you could make the white of the eye bigger. You don't need to just paint the protruding eye that's sculpted on. You can paint it all the way around into the socket. That gives you a bit more area to work with, and then when you paint the pupils on and things like that. But I don't want her to have really big eyes, because I don't want that kind of big-eyed look on the model. I want her to look mean and focused. So now we're painting in the hair. The colours that I'm using for the hair are, well, there's the three colours on the right there, which is Skavenblight, Dinge, Celestine, Celestra Grey, and Ceramite White. Now the hair, while being fairly simple, there are a few tricky points that you have to be careful with when painting it. And the main thing to be aware of is if you put too much grey on the hair, it will make it look like she has grey hair. You have to do these quite high reflection points with lots of black around them. Now I'm going to use exactly the same technique that I used on the face and also on the gold, if you've seen the previous videos. So I'm looking at how the light's hitting the hair, which will give me a guide to paint how the hair shines. Because obviously hair has a certain amount of shine to it. So the main colour for picking out the highlights is Celestra Grey. The Skavenblight Dinge is there to blend in the colour. The reason for that is because if you just paint it all Skavenblight Dinge, what you'll find is you'll be tempted to paint too much of the hair grey again, just so that you can see the marks and the transitions that you're making. What you will find when you paint the Celestra Grey on is that it's obviously a very harsh mark, and you'll be like, oh, it's really bright now, and it looks odd, but obviously you'll blend that in as you go along. The tricky highlight points on this, on the hair, are the braid in the tail, because all those overlapping points create lots of reflection points, and also obviously you have to paint both sides of the model. So, well, let's assume the model has to. Well, you have to paint from multiple angles. But if you do certain angles, you'll be able to see those reflection points when looking at the front of the model, and then that'll look wrong again. So you'll see as I go along when I paint the hair. Also, there was a little thing as well. You'll see in the behind the neck guard there is a black neck protection thing. I'm guessing that's just Games Workshop, so they don't have to sculpt in necks and holes and things and make it all look realistic in there. And what I found when highlighting that edge on this black neck covering is that I kept catching the gold neck guard. So my tip as well is don't glue the head in. Just put it in there with blue tack, and you can take it out and paint some of these hard to reach areas. It is important, however, to have the head on when you're painting on the face and the hair, because you need the light to be consistent. Now this is a problem with people painting everything in small sections and then sticking the model together at the end, because the lighting is all inconsistent when you put it together, and it looks a bit strange. So you have to create a balance between obviously there's going to be sections on the model where you can't get your paintbrush, so those need to be painted separately. But if you're doing that, always keep putting the model together and touching it together so you can see how the light's hitting it, to make sure you're getting those light points in the right place, or it will just look wrong when you put it together. Now unfortunately my secondary camera ran out of battery while I was for the recording the wet palette here, so there'll be a few moments before I notice that, and then I change the battery. I've ordered some connectors so I can connect the cameras to the mains for doing this, so it doesn't happen again. but I'll talk you through it the best I can anyway. So you can see here I've been using the Ceramite white for the highest highlight points now, and obviously they look really bright and shiny. To some extent it's overemphasized because my lamp is really close to the model, so I can see what I'm doing, because it's obviously a very small head and I need to see the details. But what I'm doing is using these Skavenblight Dinge and also Abaddon Black, and just carefully painting at these edges just to blend in the highlights a bit. Just tone them down. So as you can see, the highlights are all in line there. You should be able to notice that when holding under the lamp as the light hits the model. So as I was mentioning, keeping the highlight points consistent. But it really emphasizes the hair, so make sure when you put in the highlights down that they all line up. Obviously there's going to be gaps in between where there's these ridges and shadow areas on the hair, but really consider that the lighting has to be consistently placed, and it's not just a case of highlighting details. I mentioned before, when people look at Games Workshop highlighting, they paint a specific way for their photographs, so that their painters can all be consistent with how they paint things. It's not a case of that's the only way to paint, but what it does mean is that people tend to just go around and highlight up every detail they can see, and the problem with that is, and again it looks slightly uncanny valley with the highlights. So instead, and also what you find is that it's very satisfying to paint these details, and it can be quite difficult when you see these details and you don't paint them, but you have to force yourself to not highlight every detail up to white. Some of the details will be in shadow, so you need to stop at like maybe just 1 or 2 steps into the highlight stage, or even none. Sometimes being completely in shadow is the right way to go. So you can probably see there I put a few more highlight lines for the hair strands on the head right next to the forehead. I've overemphasized them a little bit because I was getting a bit frustrated with creating the shape of the hair, but I've still got to pull them back. The camera lighting is making them look brighter than they perhaps actually are. But I'm just using the Abaddon Black to carefully pull those highlights back a little bit, and also by adding the Ceramite white to the highest points again, because obviously you can see now how they've been blended in more, but by putting in these white dots again, that's increasing the contrast, or shortening the tonal range between the white and the black, and again that makes it look shinier. And also because of the strong white dots, I mentioned this in the previous video I think, so if you put something that's bright white next to another colour, it automatically makes the other colour look darker, and vice versa. If you put something dark next to something to a lighter colour, it makes the lighter colour look lighter. So if you put black next to white, it just makes a really strong tonal contrast, which will then kind of hide the grey I know that sounds weird because obviously the grey is still there, but because there's black and then there's white, it sort of tricks your eyes into making it look high contrast, shiny black. So here you can see by adding that bit of white there, it's just made that contrast, that tone contrast, pop out more. But then just using that Abaddon black just to make sure. And this is a good point as well. Obviously, if she was going grey, the grey would be mainly at the root of the hair growing out. Making sure that the roots of the hair are dark will also inform you that she's not going grey, and kind of make you think, oh, it's highlight hitting the hair. So what I'm doing here is just extending down the hair at the side. The sculpting on the model doesn't have hair going this low, but it looks a little bit like she's tied her ponytail too tight and is giving herself a facelift if you don't paint the hair a little bit lower here. But what is important to note is the Abaddon black. It's that the black dot right in the middle of the wet palette. I know in the top right it looks quite dark, but that's Skavenblight Dinge. That's one of the greys. The black is the one right in the middle of the palette. It's kind of soaked into the paper a bit now. It's fairly watered down. I think it's about 2:1 water to paint. I've mentioned before, don't take the exact mixtures down that I'm using because each paint is different again, and you can counteract some of it by how you apply the paint. But just having that little bit of transparency, it'll make it look a bit like very fine hair just above the ear there. So it's just a process of keep going backwards and forwards, looking at the highlights and deciding if they need a bit more softening or extending, just until you get that look just right. Now, also a point to remember is with these highlights, it's not just a case of making them look realistic and making sure the hair isn't grey, but they also have to work with the whole model. Also, the armour on this is really, really bright, shiny. You can just look at like the chest and the thigh on the model there. It's like it glares, and that means that it's really strong on the model. So the hair and the face still have to fight with those really high, bright parts on the model to stand out in their own right. So it might be a case that you just need to force that those details even more on the model. But that's something that you pick up by practice. You just have to keep looking at the model and think, does it work as a whole piece, or do I need to add more? Or indeed take parts away. So here you can see where the tricky areas I was talking about with that plait. It's tricky for some reason as well, because the plait doesn't quite make sense with how it's sculpted on that side. It's a little bit strange. The angles don't quite flow as well as they do on the front side. The hair is actually asymmetrical as well, so you see there's that kind of cornrow style thing coming from her temple on the main side of the model, but that isn't on the back side. So as I said, one side of the hair looks different to the other basically, so you have to be a little bit careful with the highlights. So here you can see I'm just going over again. It's a constant process, using the Abaddon black, pulling some of the highlights back again, and because of the detail on the ponytail, you really have to make those shapes work. So even if you can't quite figure them out, just make them up so that the shapes are defined, because the problem is that with the shininess of hair, it creates quite strong shapes with that shine. So regardless of if it's sculpted in a way that makes it so that you can see how clear those shapes are, you still have to paint shapes on that are clear. Oh, one of the little thing that I posted in between, painted, sorry, in between takes on the video is the ties on the ponytail. So you can see there's one at the back of the head and then one at the end. I wasn't sure if these were ties or not. I assumed they were because it kind of makes sense. They're not incredibly clear on the model. It could be just parts of the hair that's tied that way, but I decided to paint them as ties anyway. And I painted them in the same gold as I did the armour, just to keep the model consistent. If you're interested in those colours, they're on the previous, not the previous video, the one before that, where painting the armour colour. So there we are, there's the finished hair and face. You can see that, as I was talking about, the cloak isn't glued on because that allowed me to take it off. There's a photo of the model and the not quite as bright lighting, so you can see it a bit better. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it.